The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the deserted street. The silence was only broken by the distant hum of the city, and yet, in the heart of this quiet town, something terrible had happened. A body had been discovered. Blood stained the pavement where it shouldn't have been. Officer Grace Montgomery stood over the body, her heart racing. She had seen death before, but nothing like this. The victim, a middle-aged man in a smart suit, lay sprawled, his eyes wide open in shock, his mouth frozen in a final scream that never reached anyone. Grace's hand trembled slightly as she kneeled beside the man, scanning the area. There were no witnesses. No one heard anything. Only a cold trail of blood leading into the darkness. What kind of person would do this? And why? Every instinct told her this wasn't just another random murder. This was personal. The fact that the killer had left no clues, no obvious motive, gnawed at her. She had to know who had done this, and why. The silence that followed was suffocating. Officer Grace Montgomery stood motionless, her eyes fixed on the blood-stained pavement. What had started as a routine evening shift was now the beginning of a nightmare. She glanced up at the empty street, trying to find any sign of the killer. The body in front of her held no answers, only questions. Who was he? Why was he murdered in such a public place? There had been no witnesses, no struggle. Just a life snuffed out in an instant. Grace felt a shiver run down her spine, but she pushed it aside, focusing instead on the task ahead. The blood was still fresh, the scene untouched. This wasn't just any murder. The killer was nearby. She could feel it. The question was, who was close enough to make this happen without anyone noticing? Her mind raced through the possibilities as she looked over the man again. His expensive suit, his polished shoes, the briefcase lying just out of reach. This man had been someone, had a life, had a purpose. And now, it was all gone. She had to find out why. Grace took a deep breath, stepping back as the familiar voices of backup officers arrived. The quiet intensity of the moment was broken by the sound of footsteps approaching. She turned toward the officer in charge, Detective Mark Simmons, a seasoned investigator who had seen it all. His face was grim, and he quickly assessed the scene, his sharp eyes taking in every detail. "What do we know?" he asked. Grace shook her head. "Nothing. No witnesses, no motive. Just this." She motioned to the body. Simmons crouched down beside the victim, pulling on gloves, and began examining the body closely. Grace joined him, looking for anything out of place. "It's clean," Simmons muttered, his voice laced with frustration. "No signs of a struggle, no personal items missing. It's almost like he was set up." Grace frowned, not entirely convinced. "Set up how?" she asked. Simmons didn't answer immediately, his eyes narrowing in thought. The answer was elusive, and that made Grace uneasy. They both stood up and scanned the surroundings again. There had to be something they were missing. As the hours passed, the investigation began to take shape, though the pieces didn't fit as neatly as Grace would have liked. They had identified the victim as Michael Rayner, a businessman with no criminal record. His colleagues were shocked by the news, but no one could say why he was in that part of town. Grace couldn't shake the feeling that someone was hiding something. His business seemed clean, his personal life appeared flawless. Too flawless. "There's always something," she muttered to herself as she flipped through the notes on Rayner's life. Her gut told her that someone close to him had to know more than they were letting on. Her phone buzzed, breaking her thoughts. It was a text from her partner, Detective Blake Hunter. "Found something. Meet me at the office." A sense of urgency flooded through Grace. She grabbed her coat and rushed out, feeling that the case was about to take a dark turn. The office was only a few blocks away, but every step felt like a lifetime. What had Blake found? Whatever it was, it could change everything. The office was silent, except for the soft hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Blake Hunter, a tall man in his early 30s with messy black hair and a sharp jawline, stood by a desk, pointing to a new piece of evidence on the wall. Grace walked in, her boots clicking on the linoleum floor. "What did you find?" she asked, her voice steady but filled with anticipation. Blake didn't immediately answer. He pulled down a photo from the board, revealing a blurred image of a figure standing outside a high-rise building at night. The building where Raynor worked, he said, tapping the photo. This guy, he pointed to the figure. He was seen leaving the scene around the time of the murder. We think he might be the key to everything. Grace leaned in closer, her heart racing. Do we have an ID? She asked. Blake nodded. Working on it, but here's the kicker. The person who took this photo was Raynor's assistant, and she's nowhere to be found. Grace's gut told her something was wrong. This wasn't just a business murder anymore. There was more to this story, something deeper, darker. She had to find out what. The morning sun was barely peeking over the horizon, casting a pale glow over the city as Grace walked into the precinct. Her mind was still reeling from last night's developments, and now she had to make sense of it all. The photo of the shadowy figure left her with more questions than answers. Who was he? Why was he at Raynor's building? And why did the assistant disappear after taking the photo? The pieces were starting to come together, but they felt more like fragments of a broken puzzle. Grace paced back and forth, her thoughts consumed by the need to find this elusive figure. She glanced at the clock. It was time for her meeting with the team. She had to share her findings and set a plan in motion. As she entered the conference room, the faces of her colleagues were a mix of frustration and determination. They were all as lost as she was, but together they could make sense of the chaos. We need to find that assistant, Grace said, her voice steady but tinged with urgency. And we need to find him before someone else does. Grace sat at the table with her colleagues, listening to their analysis of the case. Detective Simmons spoke first. The assistant, Amy, is a ghost. No address, no social media footprint, nothing. It's like she doesn't exist. Grace frowned. She took the photo. She's connected to the murder. Simmons nodded. We've got a team tracing her last known whereabouts, but it's like she vanished off the face of the earth. Grace thought for a moment. We need to look into her personal connections. Who else did she work with? Who might want her out of the picture? Blake Hunter, who had been silent until now, spoke up. What if the assistant isn't the key, but the photo is? What if she took it for a reason? Maybe someone else saw her and used her as a pawn. Grace's mind raced. She had a gut feeling. Blake was right. There was more to Amy's disappearance than just a missing person case. Whoever was pulling the strings was playing a much larger game, and they needed to figure out what it was, fast. The hours ticked by as Grace and the team dug deeper into Amy's background. They discovered that Amy had been in contact with several high-profile clients, but none of them seemed to know much about her. It was frustrating. Every lead turned cold, and Grace felt like they were chasing shadows. As the day wore on, Grace sat alone in her office, reviewing the files again. It was late, and the building had started to empty. She picked up the photo again, staring at the blurry figure standing outside the high-rise. Something about the posture, the stance, it seemed familiar. The figure was someone who knew what they were doing, someone trained. Grace's hand trembled slightly as she put the photo down. She had seen that stance before, in her past. She leaned back in her chair, realization dawning on her. This wasn't just a random figure. Whoever this was had been trained to kill. She needed to talk to Simmons. This case had just escalated. Grace met with Simmons in the early hours of the morning, her heart pounding with the weight of the new revelation. I think I know who the figure in the photo is, Grace said, her voice filled with quiet intensity. Simmons raised an eyebrow. You do? Grace nodded. It's an ex-Special Forces operative. Someone I used to know. The stance, the way he moves, it's too familiar. Simmons looked at her, his expression cautious. Are you sure? Grace hesitated for a moment. I'm not positive, but it fits. And if I'm right, we're dealing with someone who can take out a man like Raynor without breaking a sweat. She paused, letting the gravity of the situation sink in. If this guy is involved, we're in deeper than we thought. Simmons nodded, his face hardening. Then we need to find him before he finds us. Grace and Simmons stood together outside a small apartment building in a quiet part of town. They had tracked down the ex-Special Forces operative, now working as a private security contractor. The door was ajar, and there were signs of a struggle inside. Grace's heart raced as she pushed the door open, her hand on her gun. Inside the apartment was a mess, furniture overturned, papers scattered everywhere. It was clear someone had been looking for something. Simmons entered behind her, his voice low. "This doesn't feel right." Grace's gut told her the same thing. They moved cautiously through the apartment, checking each room, when a sound came from the back. Grace froze, signaling to Simmons to stay quiet. Slowly, they approached the source of the noise, ready for anything. What they found next would change everything. The night was heavy with anticipation as Grace and Simmons stood in the hallway of the apartment building. The noise they'd heard earlier had led them to a small back room, where they found evidence of a violent struggle. Furniture was thrown around, and papers were scattered everywhere. It was clear that someone had been searching for something, or someone. Simmons carefully moved to inspect the room, his fingers lightly brushing the desk, which was knocked over during the chaos. "Someone's been here recently," he muttered under his breath. Grace scanned the room, her eyes narrowing. "This isn't just a burglary gone wrong. Someone's trying to cover their tracks." She stepped forward, her boots making soft echoes in the silence. As she reached the back of the room, her eyes locked on an open file on the floor. The contents were hastily scattered, but one paper caught her eye, a familiar name. "Blake," she whispered. Simmons turned sharply, his brow furrowed. "What about him?" Grace held the paper up, her mind racing. The name, it seemed, was linked to both Amy and the Special Forces operative. The plot was thickening, and Grace couldn't shake the feeling that they were closer to the truth than they thought. After confirming the name on the paper belonged to Blake Hunter, Grace's heart raced. Her instincts were screaming that he had been involved in more than just being a passive observer. The connection between Amy and Blake was clearer now, but it opened up a new set of questions. Grace walked through the dimly lit precinct, Blake's face fresh in her memory. How could he be connected to all of this without her ever noticing? She had trusted him. As the hours passed and they continued to investigate, Grace couldn't shake the feeling of betrayal. Blake had been a trusted colleague, but now it seemed like the pieces were falling into place. The file they found was just the beginning. There were gaps in his story, things he had left out that now seemed critical. Simmons followed her, noting her frustration. "We need to talk to him," Simmons said firmly. Grace nodded, her resolve hardening. "I think it's time we confronted Blake. If he's hiding something, I need to know what it is." As they reached Blake's office, Grace could feel the tension in the air. They knocked firmly, but the door was already ajar. Grace pushed it open, and Blake looked up from his desk. His expression didn't change, but there was something about his eyes, the way they avoided hers, the subtle shift in his posture, that made her heart drop. "We need to talk," Grace said, her voice colder than she intended. Blake stood up slowly, his demeanor casual, but the tension was undeniable. "What about?" he asked, his tone just a little too controlled. Simmons stepped forward, cutting off any possibility of evasion. "We found something. Your name. In connection with the case. Care to explain?" Blake's gaze flickered for a split second, but he quickly regained his composure. "I'm not sure what you're talking about," he said, his voice calm. Grace narrowed her eyes. She had known Blake for years, but now, with everything on the line, she couldn't trust her own instincts. Was he hiding something, or was this just a misunderstanding? The silence in the room grew heavy as Blake's gaze remained steady, but his mouth was drawn into a tight line. Grace took a step closer, her voice low. "I think you know exactly what I'm talking about, Blake." The confrontation with Blake hung in the air as Grace processed his words. The silence was unbearable, and the frustration of not knowing whether he was lying gnawed at her. She knew Blake, and yet something about this moment felt wrong. She couldn't put her finger on it, but his calmness seemed too rehearsed. It was then that Simmons broke the silence. "Grace, there's something else," he said, his voice tight. Grace turned to him, her mind racing. Simmons held up a flash drive. "I've been going through some of Blake's past cases. This is a file that didn't exist before." Grace's eyes widened as she took the drive from Simmons, realizing that Blake had been hiding more than just his involvement. The file was crucial, a link to the Special Forces operative they had been hunting. It seemed like Blake had been playing both sides, manipulating the investigation from within. "This changes everything," Grace whispered, staring at the drive in her hand. "We need to get answers. Fast." Grace couldn't shake the feeling that everything was falling apart. The flash drive had been the breakthrough they needed, but now, they were in deeper than they'd ever imagined. The link between Blake, the Special Forces operative, and Amy was becoming clearer, and with each piece of evidence, the web grew more tangled. Simmons watched her closely as she sat back in her chair, her mind working through the implications. "This isn't just about Rayner's murder anymore," she said, her voice low. "This goes much deeper. Blake's involved in something much bigger than we thought." Simmons nodded, his eyes filled with concern. "We need to act quickly before this all unravels." Grace stood up, her resolve hardening. "We find Blake, and we make him talk. No more lies." The weight of the investigation pressed heavily on her shoulders, but Grace knew one thing for sure. They were on the verge of uncovering a conspiracy that could bring everything crashing down. The morning after the breakthrough, Grace and Simmons stood together in the precinct, the weight of the new evidence pressing heavily on them. The flash drive had revealed encrypted files containing detailed plans about Rayner's murder, but there were still too many gaps. It was clear now that someone was orchestrating a much larger scheme, one that involved both Blake and the shadowy figure they had been hunting. Grace rubbed her temples, trying to make sense of it all. "We need to track these people down," she said, her voice tinged with frustration. Simmons nodded, his brow furrowed in thought. "But we can't just go in blind. This person knows we're getting close. We need to be strategic." Grace sighed, pacing around the room. "I know. But we don't have the luxury of time. If we wait too long, they'll cover their tracks completely." Simmons watched her, his eyes scanning the file. "Then we move fast. But we need to identify who's really behind all of this. Whoever it is has been playing a long game." Grace looked at him, a steely resolve in her eyes. "Let's find out who's really pulling the strings and put an end to this." As the investigation progressed, Grace found herself focusing on one key detail that kept resurfacing: the name of a prominent local businessman, Thomas Carlyle. He was connected to both Blake and the Special Forces operative, but there was no clear link between him and Rayner's murder, yet. Grace's gut told her that Carlyle knew more than he was letting on. She and Simmons decided to pay him a visit, hoping to get some answers. Grace knew it wouldn't be easy. Carlyle was powerful, influential, and always surrounded by people who would protect him. As they drove toward his mansion, Grace felt a sense of unease settle in her chest. "This is it," she said quietly, glancing at Simmons. "If Carlyle is the one pulling the strings, we're about to find out just how deep this goes." Simmons nodded, his jaw tight. "Be careful, Grace. He's not someone who takes kindly to threats." Grace's grip tightened on the steering wheel as they approached the gates. "I'm not here to make threats," she said. "I'm here to get answers." Carlyle's mansion was everything Grace expected: grand, opulent, and intimidating. The heavy iron gates closed behind them as they drove up the long driveway. They were met at the door by a butler, who led them through the lavish hallways, where portraits of Carlyle's ancestors stared down from the walls. "Mr. Carlyle will see you now," the butler said, his voice as polished as the marble floors beneath their feet. Grace and Simmons exchanged a glance, their instincts screaming that something wasn't right. They followed the butler into a large study, where Thomas Carlyle sat behind a massive mahogany desk. He looked every bit the part of a powerful businessman, tall in his late 40s, with a well-groomed appearance and a calm demeanor. He stood as they entered, offering a firm handshake. "Detective Montgomery, Detective Simmons, what a pleasure," he said smoothly. "What can I do for you today?" Grace studied him carefully, her mind already racing. "We need to talk about Michael Rayner. she said, her voice steady but with an edge. Carlyle's smile faltered for just a moment, but it was quickly replaced with politeness. "Ah, Michael, tragic, really. But I don't see how I can be of help." Grace didn't buy it. "I think you know exactly how you can help, Mr. Carlyle, and I think you're going to want to talk." As the conversation with Carlyle continued, Gracie's patience began to wear thin. His smooth words and evasive answers did nothing to ease her suspicion. It was clear that he knew more about Rayner's death than he was letting on, but Carlyle kept playing the part of the innocent businessman, feigning ignorance. "I'm afraid I can't help you, Detective. I've been focused on my own business these past few months," he said with a charming smile. Grace's eyes narrowed, her tone sharpening. "What business is that, Mr. Carlyle?" she asked. Carlyle paused, his smile faltering for a split second. "I'm sure you understand, Detective, that some matters are better left private," he replied smoothly. Grace wasn't buying it. "We both know you're hiding something," she said, her voice cold. "And I think you're starting to realize that the longer you keep hiding, the more it's going to cost you." The air in the room grew heavier, and Carlyle's face betrayed a flicker of fear. Only for a moment. But it was enough. Grace could feel it now. He was hiding something, and she was about to find out what. After the confrontation with Carlyle, Grace couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the brink of something huge. They had learned that Carlyle was more involved than he had let on, but the true depth of his connection to the murder was still unclear. Simmons remained silent for a few moments as they left the mansion, his mind clearly working through the implications. "We need to dig deeper into his business dealings," Simmons said quietly. "There's something there we haven't uncovered yet." Grace nodded, her mind racing. "I agree, but we can't afford to waste any more time. If we don't act quickly, he'll slip away like everyone else." Simmons looked at her, his expression serious. "We'll figure it out, Grace, but we need more evidence." Grace's gaze hardened as she turned to look back at the mansion, now receding into the distance. "We'll get it. And when we do, nothing will stop us from bringing him down." The tension had reached its peak. Grace sat in her car, staring at the file in her hands, her mind racing. They had uncovered more than they ever expected, but it was still not enough to make the arrest. Blake Hunter's betrayal was starting to take shape, and every shred of evidence seemed to point to him. He had been involved in the murder from the beginning, orchestrating everything from the shadows. It was a bitter pill to swallow. Grace had trusted him. He had been her ally, her confidante. But now, with every piece of the puzzle coming together, Grace's anger burned bright. "How could he?" she muttered under her breath. Simmons was right beside her, equally frustrated. "We need to confront him, Grace. This goes beyond the case now. We need to take him down." Grace gritted her teeth. "We will. But it's not just Blake. It's everything he's been hiding. I need to know why he did it." She slammed the car door shut, her resolve hardening. It was time to face the truth, no matter how painful it was. The moment had arrived. Grace and Simmons stood outside Blake's apartment, their eyes locked on the door in front of them. Blake had been expecting them. Grace could feel it. This wasn't going to be an easy confrontation. The anger she had been holding back for days now surged, ready to explode. Simmons gave her a quick nod. "Let's do this." Grace took a deep breath, then knocked sharply on the door. Blake opened it almost immediately, his usual calm demeanor in place. But there was something different in his eyes, something that made Grace's blood run cold. "Detectives, what can I do for you?" Blake asked, his voice smooth, yet with an edge that wasn't there before. Grace stepped forward, her gaze piercing. "We know what you've been hiding, Blake, and it's time you told us everything." Blake's smile faltered, but only for a second. He stepped back, allowing them inside. As Grace crossed the threshold, she felt a chill crawl up her spine. This was the moment. "We're going to find out everything, Blake. Don't think for a second that you can lie your way out of this." As they sat across from Blake in his apartment, the truth slowly began to unravel. Blake's face remained neutral, but the weight of his guilt was undeniable. "I didn't want it to go this far," Blake finally said, his voice low. "I never wanted anyone to get hurt." Grace's fists clenched as she listened, the sting of betrayal fresh in her chest. Then why Blake? Why did you do it? Blake hesitated, then leaned forward, his voice shaky. It wasn't supposed to be like this. I was just trying to protect my future, my career. Raynor was a threat to everything I had built. He knew too much. Grace shook her head, her heart pounding in her chest. You killed him to protect your career? What the hell happened to the Blake I trusted? Simmons stepped in, his voice hard. You didn't just kill Raynor, did you? You were part of something bigger, something we don't even fully understand. Blake looked away, unable to meet their gaze. It wasn't just Raynor, it was the whole network. I got in too deep, and now there's no way out. Grace felt a sickening realization wash over her. Blake hadn't just been a pawn, he had been a player, a willing participant in a far larger conspiracy. The pieces were falling into place, and the truth was uglier than anything she had imagined. The confession hung in the air like a weight, pressing down on all of them. Grace's mind was reeling as she processed the truth about Blake's involvement. So this whole time you've been feeding us lies? She asked, her voice shaking with anger. Blake nodded, his eyes downcast. I didn't want it to go this far. I thought I could control it. But the deeper I got, the harder it was to get out. Grace stood up, pacing the room, the betrayal cutting deeper with every word. You think you could control it? People are dead because of you, Blake. And now, you're telling me you didn't have a choice? Simmons spoke up, his voice cold. Grace, let him talk. We need to hear everything. Grace stopped, her eyes locked on Blake, her voice steady now. Who else is involved, Blake? Who's been pulling the strings? Blake hesitated, his eyes darting around the room. There's someone higher up. I don't know who they are, but they've been pulling the strings from the start. Grace's heart skipped a beat. The conspiracy was bigger than she had thought, and now it seemed like they were getting closer to the top. We'll find them, Blake, she said coldly. And when we do, everything will come crashing down. As Grace and Simmons left Blake's apartment, the air felt different. They had answers now, but the truth had come with a heavy price. Blake's confession had revealed more than they expected, and it seemed like they were just scratching the surface of a far-reaching conspiracy. Grace sat in the car, staring out the window, the weight of the investigation pressing down on her. What now? Simmons asked, breaking the silence. Grace took a deep breath, her mind racing. Now we go after the person at the top. Whoever's behind all of this, they're not going to stop just because Blake's talked. Simmons nodded. We need to be careful, Grace. Whoever it is, they're dangerous. Grace's eyes hardened as she looked at Simmons. I know. But we're going after them no matter what. We've come this far. Simmons started the car, and they drove off into the night. The investigation was far from over, but Grace knew one thing for sure. They were about to uncover something that would shake the foundations of everything they knew. Grace and Simmons finally stood outside the hideout of the top player behind the conspiracy. They knew that this was the moment that would either make or break everything. This is it, Grace said, her voice steady but full of tension. We go in now, no turning back. Simmons nodded, his eyes hardened. Let's end this. As they approached the building, every step felt heavier. They'd come this far, and now they had to face the truth, no matter the cost. Inside the building, the air was thick with the smell of dust and old machinery. Grace and Simmons moved cautiously, their weapons ready. Suddenly, a figure stepped out from the shadows. You shouldn't have come, the man said coldly. Grace didn't flinch. We're not leaving without answers. The figure smirked, then motioned toward the dark corridor behind him. If you want answers, you'll have to take them from me. Simmons stepped forward, his voice low. That's exactly what we intend to do. The fight that ensued was brutal. Grace's heart raced as she and Simmons engaged with the man in a fight for their lives. Who are you working for? Grace demanded, but the man refused to answer. He was skilled, dangerous, and relentless. But Grace's resolve was unshakable. We'll bring you down, no matter who you're protecting, she said, gritting her teeth. The man sneered. You think you're the first to try? But before he could move, Simmons tackled him to the ground. It was over. With the man restrained, Grace and Simmons interrogated him. The answers came slowly, but when they did, they were damning. Carlyle was just a pawn, the man finally confessed, gasping for breath. The real mastermind is higher up. You'll never reach him. Grace clenched her jaw. Who? She demanded. The man laughed bitterly. You'll never know. You'll die before you get the chance. Grace's frustration grew, but she didn't back down. We'll find him, and we'll bring him to justice. With the man's confession in hand, Grace and Simmons raced against time. They knew the real mastermind was still out there, and every second counted. We need to move fast, Grace said, her voice steady but urgent. Simmons nodded, his face set with determination. This isn't over yet. As they left the building, they knew the clock was ticking. But now, they had the information they needed to finally end this. The final showdown was coming. The next morning, Grace and Simmons sat in the precinct, piecing together their final move. We have everything we need, Grace said, her voice filled with quiet confidence. Simmons nodded, glancing at the evidence laid out before them. It's all coming together. We have to go after the mastermind now. Grace's expression hardened. This is the endgame. We're bringing this to a close. The reality of the situation hit her. They had crossed the line from investigation to confrontation, and this time there was no going back. Grace and Simmons stood at the edge of the city, watching as the final piece of the puzzle fell into place. The mastermind behind the conspiracy was revealed, and they were closing in on him. This is it, Simmons said, his voice tight with anticipation. We're ready. Grace nodded, her eyes sharp with determination. We've been chasing shadows for too long. This ends now. The final confrontation was just hours away, and Grace was ready to see it through to the end. The door swung open, and Grace stepped inside, her heart pounding. The final showdown was underway. The mastermind was waiting. You think you can stop me? The mastermind sneered. Grace stepped forward, her voice unwavering. We already have. The room seemed to shrink around them as the confrontation escalated. Every word felt like a shot, every move calculated. Grace knew this would be the moment that decided everything. It was make or break, and she wasn't backing down. The battle of words quickly turned into a physical struggle. Grace was quick, but the mastermind was just as skilled. Their fight was fierce, each trying to gain the upper hand. Grace's mind raced as she moved, trying to anticipate his next move. Finally, with one swift motion, she disarmed him, pinning him to the floor. You're finished, Grace said, her voice steady but full of finality. Simmons rushed in, securing the area. It's over. The investigation was over. The mastermind was behind bars, and the conspiracy had been exposed. But for Grace, the journey was far from finished. As she stood outside the courthouse, the weight of everything that had happened settled on her shoulders. We did it, Simmons said, his voice soft but filled with relief. Grace nodded, her eyes distant. We did, she replied, but her thoughts were far away. She knew that justice had been served, but the scars of the case would stay with her forever.